Hey guys, tonight we're stepping somewhere that sounds peaceful, holy, and quietly dignified, and absolutely was not. We're going inside the medieval convent. Not the dreamy, candlelit, soft chanting version you might be picturing. I mean the real thing. Stone walls that wept with cold, 6-hour prayer schedules that started before dawn, and a social hierarchy more cutthroat than any royal court, all dressed up in a habit and called devotion. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a very sincere, heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested tonight's topic. You know who you are, and honestly, you've given the rest of us something extraordinary to fall asleep to. Now, dim those lights, put on a fan, pull your blanket up, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Have you ever wondered what actually happened behind convent walls? Did the nuns ever argue? What did they eat for breakfast? And was it also terrible? Could you choose to become a nun? Or did your family simply look at you one Tuesday and decide your future for you? What did you do if you were sent to a convent at age 6 and hadn't technically agreed to any of this? How cold was cold? How silent was silence? And what exactly do you do for the next 40 years if the answer to both of those questions turns out to be very? Congratulations, you've just woken up inside a medieval convent. The year is somewhere in the 13th century. It is 2 o'clock in the morning. A bell is ringing. It will not stop. And your day, such as it is, has already begun. For some women, entering religious life was a genuine vocation, a calling so deep and certain it felt like gravity. But for a significant number of the women sleeping on these stone floors and chanting at ungodly hours, the path began not with a spiritual awakening, but with a family meeting they were not invited to attend. If you were a younger daughter in a noble household, the math of medieval inheritance was already working against you. Dowries were expensive, marriages were strategic, and the convent was cheaper than finding you a second alliance, and it came with the added bonus of divine favor for the whole family. You might have been sent at age 6 or 10 or 13, arriving with a small chest of belongings and a vague sense that something enormous had just been decided for you. Before we get into what happened inside a medieval convent, it helps to know what the building actually looked like. Because it was not, in fact, one serene room full of candles and soft music. A medieval convent was a world unto itself, a self-contained compound with more moving parts than most people realize, and significantly more drafts. The layout followed a fairly standard pattern across Europe. Built around a central cloister, an open courtyard with a covered walkway running around it, sometimes with a small garden or well at its center. Here is the thing about life in a medieval convent that modern people find most immediately exhausting. The bell schedule was not a suggestion, and it did not care about you personally. The divine office divided the entire day into structured blocks of prayer, and every single one of them required you to get up, get dressed, and get yourself into the chapel. There were 7 canonical hours. Matins and lauds in the deep middle of the night, prime at first light, first mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the early afternoon, vespers at dusk, and compline before bed. Matins was the true villain of the schedule, ringing anywhere from midnight to 2 in the morning, demanding that you rise from your thin straw mattress, stumble through a dark stone corridor, and begin chanting with full presence and spiritual sincerity. You had been asleep for perhaps 3 hours. The stones under your feet were cold enough to make your toes curl, and the woman next to you in the choir stall had been snoring rhythmically for the last 40 minutes, and somehow snapped awake looking entirely serene. You have never hated anyone so efficiently in your life. Let's talk about the uniform because you had one and it was going to define your life from the moment you professed your vows until they buried you in it. Religious habits varied by order, but the basic template was consistent. A long tunic, usually wool, worn over a linen shift, covered by a scapular, a long rectangular panel of fabric hanging front and back over the shoulders. All of it topped by a veil that covered the head and framed the face. Benedictine nuns wore black. Cistercians wore white. Dominicans wore black and white. The fabric was scratchy, heavy, and not designed with temperature regulation in mind. If you had arrived at the convent clinging to any hope of personal space, the dormitory would have efficiently dismantled that hope within your first night. Medieval convent dormitories were communal sleeping rooms, long stone halls lined with individual beds, or more precisely, lined with individual sleeping areas that ranged from a simple straw pallet on a wooden frame to something approaching an actual bed with a curtain. The mattress was a straw sack, lumpy in an irregular, unpredictable way that resisted accommodation. It also became home to fleas, lice, and the occasional small rodent with ambitions. After matins and lauds, after prime, after the morning mass, there was the matter of eating, not immediately. First there was more prayer, then perhaps some assigned work, and then finally breakfast, which in a medieval convent was a meal that approached the concept of food with admirable caution and significant restraint. The bread was not the soft, pillowy, romantically crusty bread of a modern bakery. It was dense, coarse, made from whatever grain the house could afford, often rye or barley. It was filling in the way that rocks are filling. Yes, technically, but with consequences. Above all things in a medieval convent, above all schedules, all rules, all the individual sisters with their individual personalities and their individual opinions about how the psalm should be chanted, sat the abbess, and she was not a figure you wanted to misread. The abbess was elected by the community, at least in theory, and she held an authority that was in many ways extraordinary for a medieval woman. She governed the convent's internal life completely. She assigned duties, administered discipline, managed the finances, represented the community in legal matters, and received guests. Before a woman made her final vows and became a fully professed nun, she passed through a period called the novitiate, which could last anywhere from 1 year to several. During this time she was a novice learning the customs, the prayers, the schedule, the rules, and the particular culture of her community under the supervision of a novice mistress who was essentially her teacher, her warden, and her most intimate critic. If the novice lasted the full period and the community voted to accept her, she made her solemn profession, her permanent binding vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. One of the most famous features of medieval monastic life and one of the most misunderstood was the rule of silence. Many people imagine convents as places of near total quiet, hushed and reverent at all hours. The reality was more specific and considerably more negotiable than that. Outside silent periods, speech was permitted and in practice in the workrooms, the kitchen gardens, the laundry, the infirmary, women talked. They talked about work. They talked about the readings. They talked inevitably about each other. Some orders developed elaborate sign languages for communicating during the silent periods, with hundreds of signs covering everything from liturgical items to food to specific tools. A common misconception about medieval convent life is that nuns spent most of their time in spiritual contemplation, floating through their days in a state of serene otherworldliness. They did not. The hours between the canonical offices were filled with work, practical and relentless. Someone had to grow and tend the kitchen garden. Someone had to cook the meals, bake the bread, brew the ale. Someone had to launder the habits and mend the tears and spin the wool. The scriptorium was different work, quiet, skilled, sedentary. Copying manuscripts required concentration, a good hand, familiarity with Latin. Every day or nearly every day, the community gathered in the chapter house for a meeting called the chapter. It was one of the most important institutional practices of medieval monastic life and also one of the most quietly dramatic. The chapter began with a reading from the rule, followed by discussion of community business. Then came the part that separated medieval monastic life from any kind of comparable modern experience, the public acknowledgement of faults. Sisters were expected to come forward and confess their infractions. But other sisters could also rise and accuse their fellow nuns of infractions they had witnessed. The chapter was where resentment surfaced, where hierarchies were quietly enforced. Illness in a medieval convent was a near constant fact of life, and the infirmary was one of the most perpetually occupied spaces in any religious house. Women living in close quarters, sharing dormitories, eating together, praying through cold chapels in damp stone buildings with inadequate heating. This was not a configuration that kept illness at bay. The infirmarian cultivated and dried medicinal plants, prepared remedies, and accumulated practical knowledge about what worked for specific ailments, which herbs reduced fever, which poultices drew out infection. Bloodletting was performed on a schedule in some houses. The persistent tension in medieval convent life was the question of how much the world outside the walls should be permitted to reach in. Visitors came to a designated space called the parlor, separated from the nun by a grill or screen in the presence of another sister as a required witness. The parlor grill is one of the more quietly poignant architectural features of medieval religious life. A literal physical barrier between a woman and everyone she had known before she came here. Her conversations conducted through a screen, witnessed, possibly reviewed and time-limited. Some nuns found this a freedom. Some found it a grief they never fully named. In the long rhythmically structured year of the medieval convent, feast days were not merely liturgical occasions. They were events anticipated, prepared for, and experienced with a genuine difference in quality from ordinary days. The chapel was more elaborate, more candles, more incense, the best vestments, the most polished liturgy the community could produce. And at the table was different. More generous portions, perhaps wine instead of ale, perhaps a dish prepared with more skill and ingredient than the daily pottage. These moments of sanctioned abundance were felt sharply. Death was a constant companion in the medieval convent, not dramatically, not usually with crisis, but as an ordinary and expected visitor that the community prepared for collectively. The dying sister was accompanied by her community. The body was washed and prepared by the sisters, not by outside professionals, not by strangers, but by the women who had lived alongside the deceased, who had shared a dormitory and a refectory and a choir with her for years or decades. You lived among your dead in a way that was literal and continuous. Death was not the end of membership in the community. It was a change of address within it. At the end of a very long day, a day that began before dawn with a bell and a cold stone floor, that moved through prayer and labor and silence and prayer again, that offered bread and pottage and the company of 30 women whose personalities ranged across the full human spectrum, what did life in a medieval convent actually amount to? The honest answer is that it depended enormously on who you were, which house you entered, who led it, and whether you were there by genuine vocation or by your family's convenience. For some women, the convent was a genuine limitation. For others, it provided education, authority, community, and identity not entirely defined by whose wife or whose mother you were.